Amid suspicions of fraud in the Afghanistan presidential election, both sides claim victory. Are we going to see a shared government again? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Afghans went to the poll last month, but not many of them. According to preliminary figures, the turnout was as low as 20% due to Taliban threats of violence. The official result will be announced on November 7th, but that didn't stop the two main candidates, President Ashraf Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah, from claiming victory.
The results will be announced by the Independent Electoral Commission, but we have the most votes. We have been checking the results in the past few days, and we are assured we have the most votes.
I have the statistics, but to avoid misinterpretation, I'm not going to reveal them. But our victory will be a landslide.
To discuss what's next for Afghanistan, we welcome Ambassador Omar Samad. He is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Also with us, Nadia Hashimi is a women's rights activist. From Toronto, Kamran Bokhari is the founding director of the Center for Global Policy. And also here in the studio is CGTN Correspondent Callebs. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Sean, let me start with you. The official results are not in yet, but we already have two competing sides, two rivals claiming victory. That happened in 2014 as well. That stalemate was broken by the United States. Ashraf Ghani was declared president and Abdullah chief executive. Might we be heading in the same direction this time?
It's difficult to say. In 2014, there was much more optimism. And at that time, Abdullah basically, he said for the good of the country, was going to step aside and go into that power sharing agreement with Ghani. And at the time, he was going to be the chief executive officer of the nation, Ghani the president. And he envisioned this kind of a real power sharing. Well, it didn't play out like that. So I would be surprised if Dr. Abdullah weighed in again and said, all right, for the good of the country, we don't need any more strife than we have. Let's just see how these votes come out. He's probably going to stick to his guns a little bit more. It's just difficult to say. I mean, as you pointed out, the turnout was so low, so many areas where the Taliban was keeping people away, and the areas where people did go in and vote, difficult to say how it's going to play out. And remember, one candidate has to have more than 50% of the vote, or we're going to do this whole thing over again in November.
As you say, Sean, turnout was low. The Guardian's reporting that it could be as low as 20%. That would be the lowest since 2001. Does that low turnout put something of a question mark over the election?
I think it's a litmus test of where that nation is right now. Yeah. I was there in March and April talking to people about what they either had to gain or lose if there was a peaceful handover, if they are going to negotiate with the Taliban to have some power sharing government involving the Taliban as well. And a lot of people are just, they're just kind of beaten down after 18 years of this, wondering where to go, where all the promises are, where all the money went, especially women and children. They have so much to lose after making significant strides over the past 18 years. I wish it was more optimistic, but the people I talked to were very pessimistic and didn't have a whole lot of hope moving forward. So, I've just met so many people over the years. The first time I went there was 2002. Yeah. So, now you're meeting people who, back in 2002, they said, the only thing I want are my children not to have to carry a gun. Now those children are saying the only thing I want is for my son not to have to carry a gun. So it's just heartbreaking.
Ambassador, what did you make of the conduct of the election, and how important will it be for both sides to accept whatever the outcome is?
Well, let me just start by saying that nobody expected these elections to be easy. Nobody expected it to be the right time. There were a lot of people, skeptics, who said that the timing is not right. There's a peace process going on. The election commissions are not really ready to hold these elections at the national level. There have been twice it was postponed. The candidates themselves, to the last minute, including Abdullah, was saying, even on the last day, if I know that the peace process is going to yield some results and move in the right direction, I will bow out and I will leave this contest. There were some, obviously, who wanted this to go through for political reason. President Ghani himself was one of those who was dead set on having these elections. There were some countries, donor countries, including some European countries that were very much pushing for it. And then there were, obviously, in Afghanistan, there was the political maneuverings that were taking place, pro and con elections. As far as what's going to happen now, I think that it all depends not so much on the turnout, which whether it's 20 or 25 or 30%, it's very much on whether it's going to be a cleaner, a more credible election versus the ones that we saw in the past.
I get your point about the timing of the election, but looking at it another way, doesn't it actually make the eventual winner give him a solid mandate to negotiate a peace?
We are not in a position right now in Afghanistan to either want or ask for a solid mandate. I think because there are so many big issues out there that are not in the hands of Afghans altogether. Look, the Americans are dealing with the Taliban on a withdrawal timetable, on some kind of arrangement for the Taliban to be part of a future government. The Taliban and other Afghans are willing to sit at some point under certain conditions around the table and discuss an intra-Afghan process, which would lead to a new power sharing arrangement, as was mentioned earlier. So there are so many balls up in the air that I don't think that a strong mandate is the necessary ingredient right now. What is necessary is an outcome that is better than what we've seen before, that is more credible, that is more legitimate, and then that particular outcome, which should have the backing of the international community as well as the Afghan people, should move the country towards a peace process, and a peace process that is workable, and that is not so politicized in terms of trying to, give advantage to one side or the other.
Nadia, does this process, the entire election process, run the risk of being delegitimized because of the continuing rivalry, infighting between the two main leaders, and also the low turnout?
You know, I would echo what the ambassador has just said. I think the low turnout is really a growing pain that the country is showing. This is a fledgling democracy, and so as much as we've been focusing on the past few electoral cycles for the country, we have to take into consideration that in the larger context, this is all still very new to the country. The entire system is new, and this is a country that has seen every system of government within the last 100 years of its history. And so, as people move forward, I think they really need to have credibility in the integrity of these elections. Again, whatever the percentage may be, it's the integrity of the elections that's going to give people rising confidence in their ability to come out and vote. I think that given what the perceptions were pre-elections, what people actually saw of election day, there were a lot of hiccups, there were a lot of problems with communications, with electricity, with polling stations being closed, but still, all of that being said, people were able to come out, they were able to put their votes in, and they believe that there will be some oversight wherever there were problems, where people will believe that there were issues with ballots that were invalid, they will be rooted out by this newer election commission.
All right, let me bring in Kamran Bokhari from our studio in Toronto. And Kamran, what did you make of the conduct of the election, and how important will it be for the Election Commission to show complete transparency?
I mean, it is important, no doubt about that. But the question here is that whether the person who does not win or comes in second place is going to accept that outcome. I mean, last time there were claims of foul play, which is why then Secretary of State John Kerry had to come up with this creative way of power sharing that didn't really go anywhere. In fact, that power sharing arrangement expired, and it took a long time for this new election to take place. So this is more about trust between the various factions. I mean, I've been arguing for a long time, how can the Taliban be brought in, a group that does not believe in democracy, that does not believe in participating in elections? How can we absorb that group into a power-sharing settlement when those factions that actually believe in democracy aren't able to agree to disagree?
It's an important point, Ambassador, that Kamran brings up there. You've got two factions with very disparate views on what democracy is and the way Afghanistan should go forward.
We're not there yet.
Yeah.
We're still in stage one, trying to figure out what to do with these elections. Remember, these elections were held with a lot of skepticism going into it. When they were held, there are a lot of evidence coming out. There's a lot of evidence coming out showing that there was fraud, and that maybe somewhere between 500,000 to 1 million votes may be fraudulent. But there is a system that has been put in place now that can weed it out because it didn't exist before, and that is the biometric system. And people are counting on that, and they hope that the biometrics that has been used will show what the clean vote is going to look like, regardless of whether it's 1, 2, or 3 million.
Right.
I think that is going to push us towards. Now, as far as the Taliban are concerned, we are going to sit at the table with Taliban. I think other Afghans who believe in democracy and human rights and women's rights and so on will have to sit at the table with Taliban and have that very difficult and hard discussion with them about what kind of a country we want, what kind of a country the majority of Afghans want. And so that will be the test. And until we reach that point, we can speculate about all things.
Talking about sitting with the Taliban, the National Security Advisor, Afghan National Security Advisor, addressed the United Nations only 2 days after the election. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
To the Taliban and their foreign sponsors, hear this now. A message from the Afghan people. Join us in peace, or we will continue to fight. As my colleague, Ambassador Abdullah said last week here at the United Nations, this is a fight we can win.
Those are brave words, but should the National Security Advisor be, is he in a position to dictate to the Taliban when this fight ends?
I don't think that any one person, any one authority, even the president himself, or even the head of the Taliban, or even Mr. Trump, by himself can come up with such a solution. It will take everybody, all the stakeholders, the main stakeholders, whether inside Afghanistan or those who are outside of the country, including some regional players, to find the consensus that is needed and the balance of power that is needed in order to move the process forward towards peace.
Right.
We cannot talk about peace and at the same time talk about we will fight this to the end. And the question is, who is going to fight this? It's the Afghan people. So it's the Afghan people who have paid the price, and they will continue to pay the price. And that cannot be a solution. The solution lies in consensus and in moving the process forward.
And if I can just add to that, I think
Go ahead.
one of the things that, my job I always see as an amplification of the voices of women in Afghanistan themselves, the Afghan Women's Network, women who are there as politicians, leaders. And one of the things that I think they're interested in seeing in the peace process, or however this is going forward, is a reframing of it, where the Taliban are not the ones coming from a position of power. And unfortunately, the way the conversations have been going forward is given them a position of power where they are treated as if they are some sort of heads of state. When that is the setup for a conversation, then of course these women's groups and women's organizations and humanitarian organizations are looking at the conversation and thinking, who's asking who to be able to come to the table? Who's asking who for permission to have a seat at the table here?
Kamran Bokhari, there was also a very pointed reference in that short statement that we played from the Afghan National Security Advisor to the Taliban sponsors. That was a reference to Pakistan. He didn't mention Pakistan by name, but it was almost a threat to Pakistan. Shouldn't the National Security Advisor be actually trying to enlist the support of Pakistan for this?
Well, I mean, if you're in the position of, Kabul, whether you're the National Security Advisor or the president or any other official representing that government, you have a difficult choice to deal with. You want to be able to negotiate with Pakistan, but at the same time, that Pakistan is supporting the Taliban. And I want to go back to the point made by the ambassador about, talking peace and fighting. I think all negotiations take place while both sides are fighting in the battle space, while their representatives are talking to each other. They're trying to gain leverage through the battle space. And so I think what the Afghan National Security Advisor is doing is just that. He's basically saying, look, we want to talk peace, but you keep, supplying weapons and providing sanctuary, and therefore, we need to tell you that, we're prepared for battle. That's what I would expect them to say. I don't think that that's sort of unnatural or anything wrong with that.
This battle can be won in two ways. One is to have the Afghan people back you,
right,
and agree to give more sacrifices beyond the 60, 70,000 soldiers who have been killed in the last 5 years. And number two, it requires international support as the US, NATO have provided. If that ends, that battle ends.
Right. Go ahead, Sean.
Just listening to this, you talked about a young democracy. I heard that from Karzai in 2002. That was 17 years ago. How long can you keep saying that? Secondly, in terms of bringing the Taliban to the table, the Taliban now control more than 50% of the nation. They are probably going to have a seat, whether people want it or not, at the discussions. And Karzai in 2002 said that the Taliban should not be part of any kind of peace negotiation. Now he's changed his tune 100% and says they are Afghans. They should have been in from the very beginning. That should have been hammered out at the bond discussions back in 2001, 2002. So what people in Afghanistan, the ones we talked to, and we went a lot of different places. We got outside of Kabul, which was dicey at times, but you need to do that. They want hope. And right now, so many people don't have hope. And I think that's one thing that really stands out over this. When we were there for Election Day in 2014, Kabul was like a ghost town. People were terrified to go out and vote. When there was this peaceful transition of power, it was like a big celebration, like Eid or something. And now you didn't have that this year. You have this big letdown. Oh, what's going to happen to us? And I think we can't lose sight of that. With all the discussions going on about how much the U.S. still has to work, how much other nations have to work, how Pakistan has to keep its fingers out, people in Afghanistan don't have any hope.
Hey, Anand, I'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I'll get you in a moment, Kamran. Go ahead, Nadia.
The 50% area of control under the Taliban is a very disputed number. I have research that shows very, very different figures. None of the provincial capitals are under Taliban control. Area that's heavily populated is not under Taliban control. So how much influence do they actually have in the country is probably just a sliver of what you're mentioning.
Okay, I just want to get to Kamran. I'll get to you, Ambassador. Kamran Bokhari, go ahead.
Yeah, Anand, I just wanted to point out and add to what the gentleman was saying earlier. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, the Taliban scared a lot of people off and they didn't show up at the polls. But we have to come to terms with a much deeper malaise, and that is that a lot of people just don't have that hope.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have confidence in the political system that if they went and voted, something good will come out of it. So people say, you know, I don't want to lose my life in the process. And so, of course, it's much more than the threat of losing their life. It's about whether they believe their act of casting the ballot will make a difference or not. And quite frankly, if you look at the performance of the Afghan government, it doesn't really, lead to a lot of confidence being reposed in the public.
Ambassador?
I was just going to say that confidence building is an important part of the political process in Afghanistan. And these elections, as flawed or as somewhat downturned as they are, they eventually will need to be credible enough so that they can instill confidence in a political system that is somewhat democratic in the future. We cannot go back to Talibanism, and we cannot go back to communism, and we cannot go back to any other ism. It's going to have to be a democratic system where all Afghans, including the Taliban, and those Afghan Taliban who will be sitting at the table, will agree to share power in a certain way that reflects the will of the people.
Yeah.
As far as territory is concerned, yes, I agree that the 50% may be disputed. That's absolutely correct. But if you look at the trajectory between 2004, when the Taliban reemerged, and 2019, they have more territory under their control now than they did at any other time.
Yeah.
And we are on the losing end, meaning the rest of Afghanistan, especially knowing that the US and NATO are thinking about pulling out.
And also the Afghan troops are real heroes in this. You mentioned earlier the number they've lost in the last 5 years is equivalent to the number of U.S. servicemen lost all during Vietnam.
Right. Nadia, this is a crucial time for Afghanistan. I mean, we had the election, it's taken place, we're waiting for the result. We've got the two leaders basically claiming victory. How important will it be for Afghanistan to reach some level of political stability at the government level in Kabul very quickly if they're going to start negotiations in earnest with the Taliban?
That's the same issue, right? It's the confidence building. It's people's ability to take a look at what's happened, how the elections have played out, and believe that the government transition will be smooth, will be as seamless as possible. I don't think any Afghans living in the country are thinking that this is going to be an easy process. I don't think anyone expected that this is going to, be pulled off without a hitch whatsoever. But they have to believe that at the end of the day, once the elections are officially announced, that, yes, there may be some hemming and hawing about the numbers and about fraud allegations, but at the end of the day, that the transition of power from one to another, if there's going to be one, will be pulled off smoothly. Once that happens, and I believe that the people of Afghanistan are hungry for that, they want to see that happen. They've had enough of civil strife. Once that happens, it will lay the grounds for the future election cycles. And I think in the next election cycle, if all goes smoothly, you'll see a higher turnout. It will rebound.
Kamran, we have a situation right now where the peace talks between the Taliban and the United States has collapsed. We also have President Trump, who says that he wants to leave Afghanistan. What does that leave? What are the options that the Afghan government has right now?
Well, I don't think that the president is, going to leave. I mean, we have to sort of take what he says with a grain of salt. A lot of it is, rhetoric and statements are statements at the end of the day. We should look at actual behavior. I think what's really happening is something that I was advocating for a while. Mr. Khalilzad, Ambassador Khalilzad, was talking to his Taliban counterparts and trying to negotiate. My argument was simple. Look, the Taliban are attacking. They're engaging in terrorism while their representatives are smiling at Ambassador Khalilzad and they're talking. So the United States needs to not just sit there and talk. It also needs to telegraph the message that if the Taliban can, wage war, so can the other side, so that then they can negotiate from a position of relative strength. And I think that by calling off the talks, basically the Trump administration is saying, look, we don't really have to negotiate if you continue like this.
But, Right, but trying to negotiate from a point of strength, from having a big presence on the battlefield, the United States at its height had 100,000 troops there, were not able to subdue the Taliban.
Of course, and that's not what I mean when I say, engage in some military activity. I mean, what are the Taliban doing? They are engaging in high-profile attacks. The United States needs to also strike at, Taliban interests in a way that sends a message to the leadership that they have a lot more to lose as well. It's not just that the United States will lose if it doesn't negotiate. Right. The Taliban need to feel the pressure.
Ambassador, given that the situation is what it is right now, one of the options could be for there to be a unity government.
I don't think that you're going to see a repeat of 2014 as we saw it when John Kerry went and resolved the very controversial election results. What you might see is one side winning and the rest of the Afghan political class, as well as maybe the international community, saying, we've done our best, this is as credible as we can get, and we back this, regardless of what the loser says or doesn't say. I think what you will see, and I think this is again what we are hearing at least from the Abdullah side, is that I think today he made it quite clear, he wants to create a very broad-based government if he wins.
Does that differ very much from what Ashraf Ghani wants?
Yes, it does. Yeah? Well, Ashraf Ghani says, I will decide what to do next. But Abdullah said today that he wants to build a very broad-based government, representing bringing under the tent as many of the Afghan political leaders as possible, so that then that could give them...
Including the Taliban.
So then that would give them the tool and the heavy hand to go and sit with the Taliban. This is the way this should happen, because it should be as inclusive as possible. You cannot go and sit at a peace table after 40 years of warfare in Afghanistan, or 20 years with the U.S. presence, and expect Mr. X to be there, but not Mr. Y. All of them, those who have been involved in Afghanistan's wars for the past 40 years, have, to one extent or another, have to be involved.
Nadia, I want to get to something. We've got a few minutes left. You talked about this earlier on, but that's women's rights in Afghanistan. Where does it go to after this election? There was a mayor that was elected in Maidan Shah. She's having a really tough time doing her job, very difficult. She's been threatened. There have been female mayors before. There have been female governors. But where do you see it going?
The women who are stepping up in Afghanistan and are taking on the seats of influence, who are serving in parliament, who have campaigned to serve in parliament, who are ministers, deputy ministers, mayors, who are artists, who are teachers, educators. All of these women have done so facing challenges. And so that she's facing a challenge is not surprising. I don't think it would have surprised her at the outset when she decided to take on that role. And I don't think it's going to surprise her that the challenges are ongoing. Those they're willing to accept. From the women I'm speaking to, what's very clear is that they want to be part of the future of the country. And so they want whatever happens going forward to include them. And therefore, their priorities are really on making sure that the constitutional protections that enshrine gender equality for them in the country are honored, that they are respected. Whether or not the Taliban come into some kind of peace process, it's to guarantee that they stay there. They themselves are willing to continue the fight. They themselves are willing to take on the challenges and persist.
Kamran, there is one other potential, I guess, complication in this, and that is the presence of ISIS in Afghanistan. Their presence has been growing. The numbers, it's not a big number. The membership in Afghanistan is something between 2,500 and 4,000, but you don't need a big number to cause chaos. How big a threat do they pose in Afghanistan to stability?
I think they're sort of like, at this stage, what I would classify as a small to medium level insurgency. But I think beyond the battlefield, they pose a threat to the political, negotiations or the political solution that we've all been talking about, because they're challenging the Taliban on their own turf. So the Taliban are trying to come into the quote unquote mainstream. And that is something that ISIS leadership in the country leverages and tries to siphon off fighters, more radical people in the Taliban. In the end, ISIS didn't drop in from Syria or Iraq into Afghanistan. These are, Taliban insurgents, former Taliban insurgents who parted ways with the movement to join ISIS because they obviously have far more radical persuasions. So that poses a problem for the Taliban to commit to mainstream behavior, because they're hemorrhaging and they face the risk of further hemorrhaging. And so the only way to contain their own movement as they negotiate with the United States,
right,
they have to be able to make sure that ISIS does not take advantage of it. How do you do that? You maintain a radical view yourself. Yeah. And so that's how they will. ISIS is a threat to the political solution.
Okay, very quickly.
Well, quickly, the IS that we see in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then they're mostly in the northern parts and the eastern parts of Afghanistan, is not a Middle Eastern phenomena. It is a more regional phenomena, but it's also manned, and they have a lot of former Pakistan Taliban members who have joined, and they are a threat to both the Taliban and to the peace process and to many countries in the region, including Iran and Russia.
And we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, The Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find The Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search The Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.